Okay. The last kind of thematic cluster to talk about with the United Kingdom is looking at how citizens engage politically in the United Kingdom, and there are a multitude of different ways. Oh, I forgot social class. But this will tie into political participation. So, if national origin or ethnicity is not a uh, target for, hold on a second, so now I have to stop sharing my screen so I can come. Right, sorry about that. We're buying birthday presents for my daughter. So, in terms of social class, that becomes kind of a classic middle class versus working class breakdown. You can create some kind of an inversion of the north south gap, that more folks living in the north tend to be the poorer, more industrial areas of the United Kingdom, whereas the wealthier, high tech places tend to be in the southern portions. And this image that I think came from it's either the BBC or the Times, um, kind of shows a line of demarcation in terms of where the north and the south tend to be identified. Some of the other things that increase cleavages are demands on education, that compulsory education exists in the United Kingdom, um, which is a good thing. But with that, the cost of university tuition increased to levels that make it more um, difficult for folks who are in communities of need to attend some of the more elite um, institutions, which create most portals into being politically successful. So this is an image that kind of breaks down how folks would define some of the new British social classes, and it tends to get wealthier the further to the right of this image that you move across. So you have folks who are in the lowest social class are the folks who would be described as the precariat. These are people who are not just low, having, living in poverty, but these are also folks with low level of political or social capital, which means it's difficult for them to feel like the government or the policymaking organs of the nation state kind of care for them. The next sector or the next social class will be traditional working classes. This cluster tends to be older, and it tends to be the working class in terms of people who are like blue collar factory workers. The next group over are the emergent service workers. These are people who tend to be younger in urban areas that has low economic capital because of the types of jobs that they are working, but they are having emerging levels of social or political capital because it's all about making connections. The middle class is what the middle class is everywhere, that these are people who are less culturally engaged but have more economic capital. Then you're seeing new affluent workers. These are people who are breaking out of the traditional middle class mold, that these are people probably with a middle class income, but these are people who are young and more active in the business or political sectors, attempting to create connections for movement up towards the top. And then the last two are the established middle class. These are traditional, well-to-do families who are not the most elite, but these are like the second-tier families of social systems or circles. And then you have the elite, who are the same as elite everywhere, that they tend to be super wealthy, and with wealth comes social and cultural capital. In terms of political socialization or participation, the three engines that seem to socialize Britons into their political beliefs are family, which is a model that tends to hold true in several places around the world. School civics courses will do a good job of indoctrinating folks with a lot of their service-oriented political beliefs, not necessarily their ideological beliefs. But since there is a nationalized curriculum, it does all of those things to turn the youth of the United Kingdom into, hopefully engaged, functioning citizens. And then the media, primarily engines like the BBC or Channel 4, which just kind of run the day, do a good job of kind of educating the population in a fairly politically neutral manner in terms of increasing higher levels of public knowledge on political issues. In terms of participation, you see voting waiver now for the most part between 60 and 70% turnout. It's down in recent elections compared to, the 40s through the 90s, and there are a lot of reasons why you've seen a downtrend in some of those issues. Now, what will create an artificial peak in terms of public engagement will be if you were to include in the extension of this chart, even though it says general elections, things like the Brexit referendum would be something where you would see a spike in some turnout. Voting behavior is still very predictable, like most Western democracies, being tied to social class or region will be good predictors of not only will people participate politically, but who will they vote for. And that's something that you tend to notice in a lot of traditional democratic systems. The biggest difference in terms of the UK versus other democracies is that social movements tend to be fairly weak in the United Kingdom, that the average number of people who are willing to do more than sign a petition is way lower than 20%. You don't see a lot of folks who are willing to go out and protest on a lot of different issues in the UK compared to other countries around the world. Sometimes you will have some issues that will spike levels of organized political participation in social movements. You saw some of that around the Brexit campaign. You saw some of that on issues of climate change or around the war in Iraq in the early 2000s. So they tend to be single issue centered social movements, but they tend to be weak because people don't really want to participate in them in any shape or form. When we talk about linkage institutions, political parties exist. There are several that currently have representation in Parliament. And like I said, this used to be something that we would research and share out in class. But in the name of time, I'll just share an older presentation with you all. Interest groups exist. There's interest group pluralism, which means that you have multiple groups competing for spaces on the political agenda. But most of the groups are not tied to specific issues. They are tied to particular industries. So you have things like the British Medical Association, the Farmers Union, the Trade Union Congress. And these are all groups that represent particular economic sectors. But given the trend to embrace elements of neoliberalism at times since the 70s and 80s, they have a neo-corporatist system, which means interest groups sometimes will take the lead on crafting policy to propose in the direction of parliament, and sometimes they will be overly dominant. 3 countries will all have some kind of random extra organization that is half private sector, half bureaucracy, half something else. The version of this that exists in the United Kingdom are quangos, or quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations. These are entities that are taxpayer funded but not controlled by Parliament, and they're put together to create policy that will unify the interests of the public, the government, and the public sector, or the private sector. Anybody can serve or participate on a quango in any capacity. There at one time were over 1,000 different quangos, and you've seen, in terms of things like Cameron's austerity measures or kind of more conservative tightening of the belt on economic issues to try and reduce the number of quangos to eliminate some of the excess tax dollars that were sent to this. But this is another example of kind of embracing elements of neoliberalism and neocorporatism, because you will have these organizations overseeing like regulatory policy that should be implemented. And even if the government may have a hand in terms of a member of parliament or a representative of a local government being part of a quango, this is where like the free market kind of got to take more control, because the organizations were writing regulations for themselves. The last thing to kind of look at or talk about is the kind of British political values. And there are 2 individuals that when you hear them kind of identify things, either Ethel Wood or Ken Wedding, 2 of kind of the titans of the AP Comparative Government community and review material community. You kind of just listen and accept their list as the gold standard. So what really kind of drives citizen participation or engagement will be if something is in the direction of embracing or fighting to stop the violation of one of kind of the core philosophical values of British citizens. So there's a strong adherence to devotion to justice and fair play or rule of law. You see a higher degree of respect for and protection of human rights and civil rights for all, and this is kind of the example of making sure that the Convention on Human Rights is something that was automatically incorporated into British common law. There's an acceptance of class distinctions, but also the belief that it's not a caste system, that there should be degrees of social mobility. So just because you're born into one station in life, it shouldn't prevent your movement up or your demotion down the social food chain. Equal representation is something that is an important value. Civilian government is a big deal, and that's why the bureaucracy is quite large, because the number of civil servants who work in Whitehall or work for the various bureaucratic entities that make the government work, it is done of and by the people, and not necessarily of and by politicians in all instances. Britons tend to be more cooperative and pragmatic, that there are issues that will be wholly divisive, that you'll see the political mudslinging that happens in other countries around the world, but things like the collective consensus after World War II proves that, in many instances they are willing to put their differences aside and work for what is best in the name of the common good. There's an embrace of both communal and individual responsibility, which is something that you tend to not see in all instances, that you have a lot of advanced democracies around the world that focus more on individualism over the name of, a communitarian philosophy. there's a big push for honesty and transparency. And I think that's one of the things that is unique about an evolutionary democracy, that, when you are a revolutionary government, or you are pushing for, a violent, sporadic change, you know what you want in the moment. But as you are evolving over time, I think it creates a better understanding of what you need to gain more faith or respect in the system. And then there is kind of the notion of the acceptance of an activist government, that, Margaret Thatcher's reign as prime minister is something that really bucked this trend to some degree. But as, people moved away from her brand of neoliberalism because it was much too big or much too strong, um, you are willing to see Britons who are more embracing of the government doing things, versus other democracies like in the United States, where there are higher levels of distrust or suspicion of government actions because, they think it is a chief threat to individual freedom or liberty. So these are all of the things that kind of make British citizens tick. Like I said, the only other additional set of notes that we will have before we start looking at some of our comparative exercises that we can do with the UK, Mexico, and Nigeria is looking at their political parties. And I'll get that resource to you on Classroom relatively quickly. So this should all but wrap things up for the UK, and we'll talk more during the first set of office hours. Have a good one.